Hello everybody, so today I'm not even trying to film when it's daylight. I do think daylight looks better, but oh my God, this today, oh boy, I'm not going to tell you about today, but let me just tell you, today was a real doozy. And yeah, basically just I didn't get anything done until like now. And well, I got a lot done, but just like stuff that was like consistently delaying, like being able to sit down here and do this. Anyway, so yeah, I'm filming now here like this, and I'm going to be talking about religion again. It's kind of funny because Christmas I did a video about religion, and I kind of said I think I said like, oh, maybe like every kind of 4 videos I might touch on religion, and it kind of just so happens I'm not quite doing that. No, but almost like it's kind of like, that same idea of like it's almost the anniversary of since I last spoke about it, and I'm speaking about it again. And the main reason why I'm talking about this is because it's actually based on something which happened relatively recently, which was a debate between one David Wood and Daniel Haqiqatjou. And basically the substance of the debate was Islam versus Christianity. And the two debaters, it was kind of a question and answer portion of the debate, and both debaters were asked if, like Abraham, you were asked to sacrifice your child for God, would you do it? And these are their responses.
Would you guys sacrifice your firstborns if your God commanded it to you like he did with Abraham?
I can say, yes, God commands me and I'm a prophet of God like Abraham. Yes, of course. I obey God. We hear and we obey.
And I'm a diagnosed psychopath, so I have to say there's that is something I would have a problem in that I would not believe that it's from God given the revelations that have been handed to me. But if I knew that it were from God, unfortunately I'm never in this situation. I've been commanded to love everyone, to harm no one, and so on. But yeah, I have to say that I have the sort of personality that I would obey God.
Come on, David.
If it were me.
What? Just defend Abraham. Just tell them when they ask. These liberals, just say straight, yes, God commands it. I will do that. Don't just like give this long explanation. No, just say yes. Be a Chad, David. No, be a Chad.
Look. So before I get into my response to this question, I just want to say that I like David Wood. I've mentioned him before on this channel, and the reason I like David Wood and the reason why I've mentioned him a few times on my main channel is because my first experience challenging the left wasn't gender identity. Obviously I used to be kind of just a generic progressive left-wing sort of person, and the time obviously now I disagree on gender identity, and that's probably the thing which I most obviously disagree with the mainstream left on. However, it wasn't the first thing that I disagreed with the mainstream left on. The first thing was Islam, where I basically went from being somebody who thought that Islam was essentially just, just to keep it simple, compatible with Western liberal democracy. The idea that basically, sure, there are problems with Islam, but they can just be overcome by, Muslims becoming just moderate Muslims who have respect for the institutions and values of Western liberal democracy. And now I've come to realize that the reality is that as soon as you stop doing that, you're not a Muslim anymore. That the the text just very plainly contradicts the values of Western liberal democracy. And somebody who was really helpful in getting me to realize that was David Wood. So that's kind of why he's somebody who I am, I think about a lot, and I suppose in some sense I'm kind of indebted to him. But the thing is, I do think that David Wood as a debater is sort of overrated. He has some kudos, I guess, that he's received as a debater. The three best debaters, if you were to ask the average Christian kind of involved in apologetics, would be James White, David Wood, and William Lane Craig. And I would say that of those three, James White is a good debater. William Lane Craig is a good debater. David Wood isn't actually that good of a debater. And the reason why I say that is because I routinely see him miss poor arguments being made by his opponents. I routinely see him being confronted with a question or a challenge, and there is a very obvious logical issue with the challenge being presented, and David Wood fails to address it. William Lane Craig and James White, the reason they're good debaters is because whenever there is a logical issue with what their opponent is saying, they will actually point out that logical issue. Obviously, William Lane Craig completely decimated Sam Harris in that debate where Sam Harris just kept refusing to actually address the point of the debate. So just one example from the Haqiqatjou debate.
The idea that we have from Jesus is, hey, God doesn't need you out going around slaughtering people who say something about Jesus. But notice, if we didn't hold that view, if we said, nope, anyone who says something wrong about Jesus, anyone who condemns Jesus, anyone who blasphemes Jesus, we have to go on a killing spree.
But what if you are in a Christian city or a Christian country, a nation, and there is an invading force of pagans, let's say, or whatever, atheists who want to come and slaughter all of the Christians. They want to take all of your land. They want to take all of your property. Should the Christians, as a policy, just turn the other cheek and say, live by the sword, die by the sword? We're not going to resist. Is this the kind of pacifism that you're advocating?
Daniel Haqiqatjou basically makes this argument where he does a bait and switch, where he's talking about Islam and the idea of using violence to attack those who insult the Prophet Muhammad. And he, is saying, well, yes, that's what Islam teaches, but Christians actually should have more violence, that the pacifism of Christianity is a bad thing. And he starts talking about the idea that Christians should defend themselves from attacks, physical attacks. And it's pretty obvious that that's a massive bait and switch. He's comparing using violence to silence critics of your religion with using violence to defend yourself against people actually physically attacking your religion. And that bait and switch in the debate was really obvious, but for some reason, David Wood just didn't point it out at all. Anyway, despite giving that criticism of Daniel Haqiqatjou, I also really like him. I think he's a very competent Muslim debater, and he has the advantage of being correct on a lot of points. Specifically, he is correct about what Islam is, and he doesn't try to deny it. He's very open about the fact that it commands the death penalty for apostasy. He's open about the fact that it commands the subjugation and submission of non-Muslims. He's very open about the fact that it thinks that blasphemy should be punished with potentially capital punishment in an Islamic state. He's open about the fact that these are very obviously the things that Muhammad, the example to all men, commanded. And the thing is, his main argument is that this is a good thing. He's not arguing that Islam is compatible with Western liberal democracy. He's saying, well, Western liberal democracy is bad, an Islamic state would be better. And his main argument against Christianity ultimately boils down to that he thinks Christianity is wrong because Christianity doesn't have any of these things. Now, sometimes he will argue this creates a contradiction. So he'll argue, for example, that the ethics of Christianity contradict the ethics of the Old Testament. Where he's saying, well, the Old Testament's filled with slavery and violence and all this kind of stuff, and yet the New Testament does away with that. It contradicts the Old Testament, the morality of the Old Testament, whereas Islam doesn't. In the Old Testament, if you blasphemed against God, or blasphemed, I don't know why I'm acting all northern all of a sudden, if you blasphemed against God in the Old Testament, you would possibly face some kind of capital punishment, well, being stoned most likely. And what Daniel Haqiqatjou is saying is, well, this is what we're continuing, and Muslims are continuing that idea of if you blaspheme against God, you are killed. Christians have abandoned that, and this is the problem with Christianity. The other thing he argues is that, obviously, Christian ethics has led to the erosion of Christian values. He's basically saying Christian ethics can't uphold Christian values. The Christian ethic of just letting people have freedom of religion or whatever else, not trying to force your ideas on other people, leads to the erosion of things like the family. And he also makes a big point in the video of stressing the idea that like Christianity doesn't have an all-encompassing moral system in the way that Islam does. You know, Islam is, it has basically, it's a political philosophy, really. And that's what Daniel Haqiqatjou recognizes. And he criticizes Christianity by saying, well, this isn't a political philosophy. Christianity is just a personal ethical system, and a religion shouldn't just be a personal ethical system. It should be a political system. It should be something, you know, if God exists, he should give us commands that flow from the state down to the population. And that's why he supports the idea of an Islamic state where lots of the strictures of Islam are enforced. And I think that it's a good thing he's arguing this stuff, because it's the argument that really matters when it comes to Islam. The way I would think about it, there's really 4 main arguments that actually matter when it comes to Islam, and 4 main arguments that kind of you can potentially have. The first one is, of course, is Islam true or false? Which I'm not going to get into, but obviously that matters a lot. But the second one is Islam compatible with Western liberal democracy? And this is the argument which I feel like, for a lot of people, this is an argument, but for me, it's not. And my instinct is just to say, well, if there's going to be a Muslim who's going to allow us to bypass that pointless, stupid debate that shouldn't even be, like, the thing is, if you're telling me that, you're just lying to me. Like, I don't want to have a debate with somebody who's just going to very obviously lie to me. And if somebody's going to stand up and be like, yeah, Islam's compatible with Western liberal democracy, I'm just like, well, I don't want to debate a person who's just going to lie to me. So, no, if somebody's going to stand up and say, you know, that, well, just admit this isn't a debate. No, it's clear what Islam teaches and it's not compatible with Western liberal democracy. That's fine by me. The third question is obviously the more meta-ethical question of whether or not divine command theory is valid, whether or not it's appropriate to argue that what is right or wrong is what God says is right or wrong. Obviously, you can establish that the Quran teaches certain things, but can you, from that, infer that this should, in any kind of theological or philosophical sense, compel us to uphold these values as correct? And this question, obviously, it will be familiar to people who are familiar with the presuppositional objection to the argument from evil, which is basically to say, well, if you're an atheist, what is your standard for even saying that a particular thing is evil? You know, you say this thing is evil, but aren't you, you know, how can you even say something's evil? Surely God's the only source that makes sense for saying something's evil. And obviously, I'm not really going to go into that argument. That's an argument. But the fourth argument, and this is the one that Daniel Haqiqatjou entertains, and I find it far more worthwhile, and it should be the debate around Islam. Like when Muslims debate, this should be the main question in contention, apart from maybe the first question of whether or not Islam is true. And that is Western liberal democracy good? And the thing that I like about Daniel Haqiqatjou is basically he argues not so much as a Muslim, but more like as a fascist. And it's like Daniel Haqiqatjou basically argues for a kind of alt-right stance. And I'm like, yes, good, that's great, because that's the argument you should be arguing for if you're a Muslim. So basically, he talks about how tolerance of homosexuality, tolerance of feminism, you know, women having increased rights, democracy itself, you know, the idea of like prisoners having basic standards of rights. He talks about all these things as bad things in the exact same way that an alt-right person would. You know, basically when Daniel Haqiqatjou argues against somebody, really, the argument is essentially just a slightly more religiously themed version of the debate that would happen between anybody who supports Western liberal democracy and an alt-right person. The alt-right person is basically going to challenge the idea that, or rather challenge Western liberal democracy based on the idea that Western liberal democracy has eroded many of the good things in our society, like community and tradition and, you know, certain innate values and stuff like that. And that's exactly what Daniel Haqiqatjou does. And I'm like, yes, good. Argue that, because that is what you should be arguing. If you're going to say that this religion is correct, this religion you uphold is true, if you're going to say that's correct, then this is the logical thing for you to be defending. If somebody wants to argue that Islam is morally good or even morally neutral, I don't think they can argue that Islam doesn't teach what it clearly teaches. They have to argue that what Islam teaches is correct. And I think in debates it's important to value honesty, and therefore I have infinite, immeasurable preference for a Muslim who's going to stand up and argue that feminism is the cause of great degradation in society and is totally destructive to the fabric of social harmony and all of that, than have a Muslim who's going to stand up and say that Muhammad was a feminist, you know? And that's me. It's like, again, and what's the reason for that is because I don't want to stand up and debate with somebody who's just like either so idiotic that they can't tell what Islam teaches, or so dishonest that they're not going to be honest about what Islam teaches. At least with Daniel Haqiqatjou, he clears those first two things. He's smart enough to know what Islam is saying, and he's honest enough to admit that's what he's saying. Everything else you can criticize, but at least if you clear those, like I would argue those are the two things that should be the first things you clear. The problem is if you're arguing with somebody like Ash Sakar, who calls herself a Muslim, but then claims, would presumably affirm feminism and other kind of Western liberal values. If you're going to stand up and debate her, you would have to do so recognizing right out the gate that you're arguing against somebody who's either so stupid, she hasn't even bothered to read about and learn the religion that she claims is true, and, true in a with cosmic significance and also eternal significance, or she's so dishonest that she's just pretending that what Islam clearly teaches isn't true. Yeah, I like Daniel Haqiqatjou. That's the point. But, and I just wanted to say that because obviously they have this debate, but I actually am mostly just using this as a launch-off point to talk about the question itself. Would a Christian kill their child if God commanded it? This is a question that you will see a decent amount from critics of Christianity being asked of Christians. People say, a lot of the time on, like the Christianity subreddit, there were people who, I'm now banned from the Christianity subreddit because I kept saying that Catholics weren't Christians. But basically, a lot of the time on the Christianity subreddit, you would get people saying, hey, would you kill your child if God asked you to? And, it's a question where I think you can usually sort of tell what it's supposed to be doing. I think, and the thing is, okay, it's a fine question to ask. I don't think asking the question in itself is wrong. But having said that, you can also tell that there is kind of a motive behind the question, a goal of the question. I think the goal of the question a lot of the time isn't actually to get, people aren't asking this to be informed. Like sometimes people ask questions like, hey, I want to be informed on this. What you realize a lot of time in religion is that, in discussions of religion, is that people will often not ask questions because they want to be informed. They'll ask questions because they want to show that you're wrong. Whatever the question is, it's not, hey, I've got a question. I really want to know your answer to this. I want to be informed by you, somebody who presumably knows your religion well. What do you think about this? It's usually, oh yeah, well, would you do this? Or, oh yeah, well, how does this make sense? Blah, blah, blah. And in this case, obviously, the point is that either the Christian says yes, and then you say, oh, you psycho. Or the Christian says no, and then presumably has to do some kind of mental gymnastics. And I've said before, I hate that term, mental gymnastics. Has to do some kind of mental gymnastics to defend why it is that they wouldn't do it. Now, obviously, as you could tell, Haqiqatjou in that clip said yes unambiguously because he'd obey God. And, that's always, I do think that's a fun way of doing it. And one of the fun things about being religious is it does usually create a way that your morality will be slightly different from the morality of a lot of atheists. And it's often, sometimes you do get those fun moments where you do just get to say like something which they're just going to completely disagree with. And it's just like, and, within that context, I think he probably enjoys just being able to go, yes, get over it. He's God. If he commands me to do this, I'm going to do it. And to be honest, the funny thing is that I don't have a problem with Daniel Haqiqatjou saying that. Considering, I have a problem with the fact Daniel Haqiqatjou is Muslim. because I think Islam is wrong, not to mention immoral. But the reality is, if Daniel Haqiqatjou is going to say that, Daniel Haqiqatjou is going to be Muslim, then I think it makes perfect sense. Like, I don't have a problem with Daniel Haqiqatjou saying that he would sacrifice his child if God commanded him to, given that I also know that Daniel Haqiqatjou is already Muslim. That makes complete sense to me. David Wood also said yes, but in a slightly less committed way. And this is another example, again, of why I think David Wood is not necessarily a good debater, because I don't think his answer to it was very good. He basically pointed out that he is a diagnosed psychopath, which he is, and that's awesome. I like the fact, because it's I'm going to sound like a real SJW here, but it's nice to see mental health issues kind of like normalizing conversation around that. David Wood's really good at that, because he is a psychopath, and he's admitted before he just doesn't engage with morality on like a moral or like an emotional level. And David Wood actually went to prison when he was quite young for smashing his dad's head in with a hammer, where he then discovered Christianity and has now gone on to talk about all this stuff. And he like earned his doctorate in prison, which, it's kind of funny, because in my last video I kind of like said, why is it that people don't leave prison just immediately with doctorates? I was like, yeah, because that's kind of what I think. Like, you're in prison, you might as well. And yeah, so he became a doctor in prison, and now he's thingy. But yeah, the thing is, like, a lot of the time he's very kind of it's sort of, I think it's like kind of an idea of like, if there's something that people are going to attack you for, you should own it. And David Wood definitely does that with the whole psychopath thing, where like although lots of people will they'll call him Hammer Time because he smashed his his stepdad actually head in with a hammer. So it's like, it's Hammer Time. David Hammer Time Woods, they call him. But the thing is, like, obviously, when that's just a thing that you're going to carry around with you everywhere you go, you are a diagnosed psychopath who attempted to murder your own stepfather. The best thing you can do is just own it, just mention it. And David Wood definitely mentions the fact that he is a diagnosed psychopath quite a lot. And in this context, he's basically says, I'm a psychopath, so if God does it. Which, to be fair, I mean, he's kind of touching on something that he's mentioned before, which is like that if he were a Muslim, he would do all the things Islam commands, even while those things to a lot of people would seem incredibly immoral, because to David Wood, the idea of morality just isn't really a thing he's conscious of or cognizant of. Like, everything that David Wood does that's moral extends not from his own sense of morality, but from his intellectual recognition of Christianity's truth, and by extension, the things that Christianity claims would be true. But yeah, basically, so yeah, I just want to say that briefly. But the point is, like, he's kind of like not saying like, well, yes, I do it because God's commanded. He's saying like, hey, I'm a psychopath, so yeah, I would do it. But he's not like fully committed to it. And obviously, Daniel says, hey, come on, David, why can't you defend Abraham? And it works with his wider point of that's what Daniel Haqiqatjou is all about. He's like, well, Christians, the problem of Christianity in Daniel Haqiqatjou's view is that Christians won't just say, oh yeah, that Old Testament person, for example, like Moses. Obviously Moses, he sees the Israelites worshipping a golden calf, and he basically, well, he doesn't directly kill them, but he commands lots of them be killed. So yeah, basically, he institutes the death penalty for idol worship. And lots of Muslims will say, Christians, why can't you just do that too? Why can't you just be like Moses? Muslims are like Moses. If Muslims saw a bunch of Hindus worshipping an idol, they would be taken out into the streets and stoned or decapitated. That's what would happen in an Islamic state. So Muslims who know their scripture and know that's what would happen and think that's a good thing will say, Christians, why don't you just have that too? And in this example, he's saying, look, why can't Christians just say, yes, if God commands me to kill my son as a sacrifice, I would do it, because you're just supposed to obey what God says. That's what they did in the Old Testament. It's what they did in the Quran. Why isn't it just the standard now that Christians claim to have a theology going back to the Old Testament? What's changed? Why has it changed? So with that in mind, I'm going to very much annoy Daniel, even though he's unlikely to see this video, by saying, no, if God asked me to sacrifice my son, no. And the reason for this is because if God asked these things, I wouldn't be a Christian anymore, which would mean the entire foundation for me even thinking that God should be worshipped would be shaken. Suddenly, if God is asking me to do this, then as far as I'm concerned, it's no longer the Christian God. Or if it is the Christian God, then it's a Christianity that is utterly foreign to me. And the reason I say this is because the main reason I'm a Christian is because the theology of Christianity, of biblical Christianity, is coherent and intricately so. And the point is that there's this idea in Christianity that it's not as if any revelation goes. And the reason for that is because each revelation builds slightly on the revelation before it. And this is something which I love about Christianity. It's something which very much leaves me inclined to say that Christianity is true. And it's that in all other religions, I say all other religions, that's not really true. In other religions that kind of claim to have like this idea of a prophet, there's a point at which somebody comes along and just says, okay, it's a total do-over. Joseph Smith, for example. If you question a Mormon about areas of the Bible that contradict their beliefs, I would say, oh, that's a corruption. That doesn't count. Here's the difference, okay? In Christianity, in the Bible, you can't do that. I don't say that there was any point in the Bible where something's just a corruption that doesn't count. The reality is that everything in the Bible, like it's a revelation that builds on each other, and there was no point at which somebody could just come along and go, it's just a total do-over, we're just breaking everything down. Instead, every single time it was building upon stuff that happened before. And that's what I find incredible about the Bible. The fact that it's not just like, it's all of these different authors, all of these different writers, all of these different, editors and all that as well. And also, of course, the prophets who are actually preaching this stuff. All of them independently coming up with this stuff that gels together, not only with what was contemporary, but also with what came before, and also setting up things that would come later. And, the reality is there's stuff that's said in the Old Testament that, why did these people write this stuff? And isn't it fantastic that this stuff then leads on to stuff in the New Testament? That there's stuff, like way back in kind of the patriarchal period of the Old Testament. Patriarchal meaning in the time of the patriarchs, rather than, like the way you'd probably be used to me saying the word patriarchal. Back in the patriarchal time, that was leading on to the historical time, that was leading on to the prophetic time, that was leading on to the, the Gospels, which was leading on to the epistles and the writing of Paul. So Paul says all of this stuff, and if you compared this stuff to the time of Moses, or even the time of, especially the time of Abraham, you would go, what is this? These are two very different religions. There is not really very much overlap at all, if you like, between what Paul was saying and what Abraham and Moses were saying. But here's what's missed out. The fact that you have all of these intermediary moments of revelation, and each time it's building off something. So, the idea of God's kind of like forgiveness and stuff like that, and a real stress on that, and the idea, of course, of the kind of restoration of Israel, that really gets developed in the prophets. And obviously that then gets fulfilled with Jesus, who, says all this stuff. And obviously, things even happen outside of his control, like, for example, being rejected by the Jews. And that's when Paul comes along and says, yes, God is restoring his people, but his people aren't the Jews. His people is now everybody. Now he's bringing all people towards him. Like, that's an idea which developed. And the thing is, you can't come along and be like, oh, Paul just made all this stuff up. Because he didn't. Because if Paul made all this stuff up, then why was it being set up centuries earlier? And that's kind of what I mean when I say Christianity is coherent. And if you don't recognize that as a key reason to believe in Christianity, then I don't, especially if you are a Christian and you still, don't think that's important, then I don't know, like we have different, I guess, values or whatever. But the thing is, of course, it doesn't surprise me that a Muslim would just say that any revelation goes, because Islamic theology isn't coherent. Islamic theology is all over the place. Not only, of course, the fact that you do have the situation of Muhammad is not beholden to the Bible. He pretends he is at points. He says like, oh, if you just read the Gospels, it will confirm my faith. But obviously, if you look at Muslims now and you say like, well, hold on a minute, the Gospels contradict Muhammad, they'll say, oh, well, the Gospels don't count. The reality is that the Quran was a do-over. There's no intricate connection between the Bible and the Quran. Well, like the Quran, where the Bible is like subtly setting up things that will be revealed and make more sense with the coming of Muhammad. No, it's just a complete do-over. And of course, the theology, even within like the Islamic scripture itself, is all over the place. And that's one of the other issues there, is the fact that the history is also really messed up with the fact that like some parts of the Quran might predate Muhammad, and we also don't really know if Muhammad even existed. We don't even know like, lots of the actual like stuff by which we now know and understand the Quran was written thousands of miles away from the Quran, when the Quran was supposedly written, which again, it might not have actually been written there. So yeah, we know nothing, but what we do know is a massive mess of like God being completely inseparable, but then like he has a multiplicity of attributes, and also the Quran is the word of God, the eternal word of God, but also the Quran is also a personality, and that personality is made up of several different surahs, which are also have personalities. And that's just talking about like the idea of the Unitarian nature of God, which is supposed to be the thing about Islam, which is super simple, and yet that's not even simple. It's a mess. So it completely makes sense to me that if a Muslim is commanded to do something by God, they'd say, yeah, sure. All right, being commanded by God, anything goes. Like if a Muslim's commanded to sacrifice their child or anything else within an Islamic system, that like the way that Islamic revelation works, there's no reason to doubt anything that is revealed, because this is already something where you can have an entire established revelation in the Bible, for example, and that just gets completely overturned when some angel starts talking to Muhammad, supposedly. And it's like, well, if that's how it works, what's to stop, if a angel starts revealing stuff to you, a loyal, faithful Muslim, yeah, why shouldn't you just be like, yeah, whatever it is, whatever's commanded, I'm going to do it. And that's the issue, because if a Christian is commanded to do all this stuff, you can't ignore the fact that Christian theology is no longer coherent. Because if Abraham, or rather, if I, like Abraham, was asked to sacrifice my child, it ignores the fact that the entire point of the story of Abraham and Isaac is that we're not supposed to sacrifice our children to God. That's the point of the story. So if I have this story about how we're not supposed to sacrifice our children to God, and then I get a message saying, sacrifice your children to God, then that's a contradiction. That's no longer coherent. There's no reason for me to take that seriously as a revelation. So it would not be theologically coherent, and therefore the entire basis for why anybody should be a Christian, which is the coherence of Christian theology, just falls apart entirely. Now, I do just want to address a few important points. And the first of those points is that the Bible is anti-human sacrifice. Let's be very clear on that. And let's start with Abraham, the obvious example of how anti-human sacrifice the Bible was. Abraham was willing to sacrifice his child to God, and yet God told him not to. There was no doubt that Abraham was down to do this. Abraham's like, yeah, sure, if it's up to me, I'm doing it. So what's the one thing that stops Abraham doing it? God stopping him. So what is the what is the variable when it comes to whether or not Christians should sacrifice their children? Not the individual inclination of the Christian, but rather the fact that God says, don't do it. That even if you're willing to do it, God jumps in and says, hey, don't sacrifice your kid. I don't understand how anybody could possibly read a story about a guy who's willing to sacrifice his kid and then is told explicitly by an angel of God not to do it. How they can read that as anything other than don't do it. Think about it. If God wanted you to do it, and wouldn't the story about the guy who was willing to do it end with the guy doing it? The only conclusion, the fact that the story about the guy who was willing to do it ended with him not doing it, shows you that you shouldn't do it, that God doesn't want you to do it. There's no doubt about it. But obviously that's not all we have. There's also the fact that the genocide of the Canaanites, and I'm comfortable calling it genocide, and I'm comfortable saying it was a holy, divine mission of God that I think was fully his prerogative. And that's an example of where, like, when you're a Christian, you can say things that, atheists are going to be horrified at. Like, no, you're supposed to think that the genocide of the Canaanites was a terrible thing. No. Anyway, basically, the reason that was commanded is because they were practicing child sacrifice. There's actually, and this is a little bit dubious because it's from the Romans who liked to speak negatively of the people they conquered. But obviously the Carthaginians were descended from the Phoenicians, who had a religion adjacent to the Canaanites. And the Romans reported that basically children, as part of these sacrifices, would have been cooked alive in giant bronze ovens. So that's how they sacrificed children. They would put the children in these giant bronze vessels and then light a fire under that vessel and kill the child by cooking them alive. Certainly, it's undeniable that children were burnt as offerings to the Canaanite gods. Maybe alive, maybe they were killed first, but definitely they were set on fire and burnt. And that's the thing, okay? It's not exactly clear that this is why God said, wipe these people out. And by the way, important to bear in mind, genocide, but bear in mind what genocide means. It doesn't mean every single one of them was killed. It means that there was a mission to wipe out this culture. And that's why there are stories in the Bible about Canaanites converting and coming to God and being accepted. So it wasn't a racially motivated eradication of an entire group. It was an attempt to eradicate this culture, which had become so corrupt that they were now killing their own children as a sacrifice to their gods. And God found this so morally offensive. Think about this for a second, okay? After the time of David, there's a 1,000-year period where God never once says, wipe out this group of people. God, there was one specific moment where God was like, okay, wipe out this group of people. And what was it? It was the people who were famously sacrificing their children, offering up their children to Molech, as the Bible puts it. Now, so what does that tell you? Well, again, you can't say like it definitely says that's right why it was happening. And I don't think the Bible anywhere explicitly says this is why you need to wipe them out, because they're going to, basically it's wipe them out because they're wicked. And well, yeah, they're pretty wicked. They're killing their own children as a sacrifice to their God. That's pretty wicked. Now, the third point is that we also know that the Israelites start to pick up this practice themselves. Now, there's another thing here, which is that the Bible makes a point of the fact that the eradication of the Canaanites was unsuccessful, that Canaanite groups stuck around, and that therefore lots of the evil and the kind of moral pollution spread. That's one of the ideas. So while it was an attempted genocide, it was unsuccessful, and that led to problems down the line. And basically, the Israelites, spoiler alert, were very rebellious against God, generally, throughout the Bible. And one of the points where it gets very bad, the kind of point which it gets really terrible, is when the Israelites start practicing child sacrifice, and they start taking children to the temple of Solomon, where God is, and burning their children there. And this time we know the Bible specifically says that this is what they were doing. That it says, the Israelites started taking their children and burning them outside the temple. And we also know that this is when God says, enough is enough. You're going into exile. And this is when the Babylonians come, destroy Israel, take the Israelites out, move them away. So the point is, they start this human sacrifice, and it's just, I don't know why I got my hair. It's just, you're done. You're done. And to some extent, I'm kind of thinking, you could say, this idea, cultures that have practiced human sacrifice have generally, quite consistently found themselves being forced out. Kind of you could say to some degree, genocided, although obviously in some cases we're talking about less, even less kind of successful, but depends how you define it. But obviously, you had the Aztecs who once ruled a massive empire. They did human sacrifice. They didn't end well. The Celts also, the Celts did human sacrifice, and they were pushed out into the hinterlands of, or not the hinterlands, whatever, into the outskirts of their own place. Obviously, the Cornish, Welsh, and Scottish Gaelic people are still under the thumb of the United Kingdom. Ireland was for a long time. Again, you could make an argument that there is an idea that, hey, if you start doing human sacrifice, you're going to find that your culture quite rapidly gets smashed into a billion pieces, and you really don't do well for yourself. So yeah, but the point is, within the biblical context, it's Israelites do the human sacrifice. God says, right, that's it, that's enough, last straw, you're done. Well, obviously he forgives them later, because that's what God does. It's kind of his thing. Now, the other point is the story of Jephthah, which is in Judges. So the story of Jephthah basically goes, and I'm sure you all know it, Jephthah is around in the time before the kingdom of Israel, but when the Jews were getting established in Canaan, and Israel's getting subjugated by a group of people, and he becomes a warlord, a fighter, a guy who's going to push out all the baddies and reestablish Israel. But he makes a vow. He says, "Oh God, if I win this battle, then I promise the first thing that I see alive when I get to my house, I will sacrifice it," thinking it will be an animal. So he goes out, fight, wins, comes home. Who's there to greet him? His daughter, who's been missing him. Hello, Papa, welcome home. And Jephthah's very sad. He's very sad because he made an oath, and now he's got to do it. And he does it. He kills his daughter. That's the story. Jephthah kills his daughter. Now, here's the thing. This is slightly different, and it's one, so, people will, people use the story of Abraham to try and show that the Bible is pro-human sacrifice, which again, I just don't understand that. The bit where the Bible, God literally says, don't sacrifice this person, that shows the Bible's human sacrifice, but whatever. But people who, I don't know, maybe a little bit smarter, will try to use the story of Jephthah and be like, oh, the story of Jephthah is pro-human sacrifice. And, in some sense, this is slightly different because Jephthah is a hero in the story. He defeats, as I put it, the baddies, which of course, that idea of the baddies doesn't really gel to a kind of biblical morality. But he pushes out the non-Israelites. He pushes out the people who are occupying the land. And so within that context, he's a hero, right? He fights for the Israelites against the enemies and he vanquishes them. But the thing is, every single major character in the book of Judges is a tragic hero. And they're a hero who has some kind of vice which leads to their destruction. Obviously, another example you probably know from the book of Judges is Samson. Samson, he's very angry, but he loves the ladies, he does. And obviously he marries a Canaanite woman. Oh, what's the name? Delilah. That's it, Delilah. He marries a Canaanite woman, And then what happens? She ties him up. He gets captured. Oh dear, no good. The point is, and obviously you have Gideon as well, who's just very angry and like not, you know. But again, the point is, they all have this thing which, like, they're good, they're heroes, they're fighting the good fight, but they have this flaw. And the point overall of Judges is, first of all, to show Israel's rebellion, which is going to be a bit of a theme, but also the unreliability of human authorities. The fact that you can't, like, this idea that some human hero is going to come along and just, you know, like, defeat the enemies in this big battle. It doesn't work. That these people that you're expecting, that the Jews were expecting and still are expecting, because they didn't get the message about how this isn't what you should be waiting for. And this is, by the way, yes, another example of the Bible being fantastically theologically coherent, where this idea that this big military victory is not going to happen because these are the kind of people that you're looking towards. Jephthah, Samson, we get the archetype of the kind of triumphant military hero. And what is it? They all have these negatives, these downsides, these bad things going on. And of course, what's the solution? Well, we get the solution later on. It's Jesus who defeats evil not by fighting it in a big battle, but by dying on the cross and taking on the sins of humanity upon himself. Isn't it a fantastically coherent theology? But, the reality is that that's the point. You don't trust human authorities. You don't say, well, yeah, our hero's going to be this just human who's going to defeat everyone using his military power. And that's the point of Judges. And it's, so again, if the thing is, Jephthah is sandwiched between Samson, who marries a Canaanite, which the Bible explicitly commands against, and Gideon, who literally murders a bunch of his fellow Israelites because they refuse to help him. And also it leads to a huge amount of destruction and civil war after that. So it's pretty obvious that Gideon and Samson are not supposed to be read as anything other than tragic heroes, anti-heroes, if you like. Like they obviously have a positive thing they do, which is, help to defend that homeland, Israel, from the invaders. Positive thing. But they also have these evil attributes, which are in direct contradiction of God's commands. When we have Jephthah sandwiched in the middle of that, and we think, oh, it seems like he's doing a good thing, but then he does this sacrifice thing. Yeah, spoiler alert, we're not supposed to read the sacrifice as some good thing, as some example of Jephthah being so noble and heroic that he sacrificed his daughter. No. The reality is, and you could say, well, why doesn't God show up and stop it? He did in Abraham. Well, because God does different things at different times. And there's, the reality is that Jephthah could have read the Bible, and heard the story of Abraham and got the message that you're not supposed to do that. But he didn't. That's the reality. So the point is, the Bible is very reliably, consistently against human sacrifice. And based on the Bible, the answer to would you sacrifice your child if God asked you to should be an emphatic no. Like based on the Bible, which has all these stories of people sacrificing their kids, and it's a bad thing, or in the one case, agreeing to sacrifice his kid, and then he's told, actually, no, don't do that. That's not what we do. It's not how it's going to work. No sacrificing kids, Buster. If the coherence of Christian theology matters to you at all, then the answer to would you sacrifice your kid if God asked you to should be no. So here's the thing of obviously going back to Abraham. Why was the command made? Why not just say, don't sacrifice? And I think the reason for this is pretty obvious. It's because the people around Abraham, as I've already mentioned, did sacrifice their children to their gods, and they saw that as a great sign of their faith. Like, look at how faithful we are. Our children, the next generation, like the next generation of kids would have been so important to any culture, and they're showing this is how faithful we are. Because obviously that's what a sacrifice is. You You sacrifice something you need, something of value, to just show how much you trust in your God to give you something of greater value. And they're saying, look, we're doing it for our kids. That's the most valuable thing ever. And we're doing that to show how faithful we are. So the point is that it would have mattered that the early Jews could show that their aversion to human sacrifice was not based on a lack of faith. Because think about it, if the Canaanites come up against the Jews and they say, you don't sacrifice your kids. We sacrifice so many kids. We've sacrificed like 100 kids today. You've not sacrificed any kids. You don't have any faith in your God at all. That wouldn't have looked so good. But the reality is that Isaac was Abraham's only legitimate son. And Abraham had there's a whole narrative about Abraham was really old and he'd been got this promise from God that he would have a son, but he'd kind of stopped believing it because it had taken ages. There's a whole other thing that happens there, but basically that's all going on. And then he gets this son. It's like, yes, he's really old at this point. He's got a son, basically, miraculously. And then God says, sacrifice your kid. And that shows, the fact that Abraham agreed to do that shows that he still had faith. Because think about it, his faith, and this is also apparent in the narrative, his faith is getting tested by the fact that God has promised him this son, and yet for years after this, he doesn't have this son. That even though God's promised a son, he doesn't have it. And then, but to show that even while his faith is weak, and there's this thing which, he's been being prayed for ages, and then he gets that thing taken away from him, he still agrees to do it. The point is that nobody could read that as anything other than showing Abraham's tremendous faith. But God says, okay, good, you've shown your faith, but don't sacrifice your son. I don't want you to. So it's by giving the command to sacrifice his son, saying, okay, Abraham, sacrifice your son, show how much faith you have in me. Abraham shows all that faith he has, but then God doesn't want people to sacrifice their son. So basically you get the best of both worlds. You show the faith, you show the Canaanites, hey, we have just as much faith as you. Our father Abraham, he had loads of faith. But you don't have that whole idea of actually doing it, which is nice. Now, this does create another question, which is, was Abraham immoral? Obviously, Daniel Haqiqatjou is hey, why can't you just defend Abraham? But okay, let's talk about this. From Abraham's perspective, being asked to sacrifice your kid was normal. And he was sad about it, but it wasn't a foreign concept. And if anything, the fact that he was sad about it means it kind of makes it almost more intense, because when God asks him that, it's not some out of left field thing. Abraham lived in the ancient Near East. He would have been familiar with the idea of people sacrificing their children as a show of faith to God. So when God says this, that's intense, because he knows that people actually do that. It's actually a thing. There's a precedent for it. And he's okay, I guess the Canaanites are right. This is the kind of thing God commands. So for him, this is just a thing that you could reasonably be expected to do. So from that perspective, the big shock of the narrative isn't Abraham agreeing to do it. Abraham agreeing to do it makes complete sense. The shock is God stopping it. It shows the kind of person God is, or rather 3 persons, but it shows the moral character of God, that he's saying, no, I'm, Abraham agreeing to do it isn't the issue. And Abraham thought that this was something which you could authentically believe, or, you could believe was that which God would authentically want. And that therefore he was just obeying God. And, therefore, even while for me, it would be immoral for me to do it, because it would be obviously against the will of God as laid out in the coherent theology of the Bible. For Abraham, it would have been that's what you do. And it makes no sense at all, I don't think, to subject his willingness to do that to moral critique, when from his perspective, the idea this would have been a thing you shouldn't do wouldn't have been on his radar at all. Now, we're going to end with point number 10. Well, I don't know why I say point number 10. I number my notes. but I usually, and it often ends up as around like 10, stuff like that. And it's not on purpose. I don't try to split up into 10 kind of points, but here we are. And what we're on is, what about Jesus's sacrifice? This is kind of, we're done with the Abraham thing as far as I'm concerned. I think we can show the Bible is against human sacrifice. That therefore, if God asks you to do it, it would mean that Christianity would have to not be true, because suddenly the theological coherence, which is one of the main strengths of Christianity, goes completely out the window. I think we're all happy with that. But what about Jesus' sacrifice? Because you could say, well, wasn't Jesus' sacrifice a human sacrifice? He died on that cross, and he didn't have to, but he did it, as a way for Israel to, the elect to be forgiven for their sins. Surely that's a human sacrifice. But obviously, in another sense, it's a total reversal of the entire idea of human sacrifice, because God in human form is serving as the sacrifice. So in some sense, you can be like, well, hold a minute, the Bible's against human sacrifice, but then Jesus, who's a human, is sacrificed. But you could also point out Jesus was God in human form, and therefore you have a reversal of human sacrifice. Because traditionally in human sacrifice, humans were sacrificed to appease God for the sake of God. But in this situation, God is sacrificed for the sake of humans. So actually you have this really clever reversal, where we are saved, human beings are saved because of God dying on the cross. Which is, again, you could say, well, it technically is human sacrifice. I mean, it's a sacrifice. Obviously, it was a sacrifice for Jesus to do that. Jesus was a human. So you could say it's human sacrifice. But again, that's only if you kind of miss all of the actual kind of interesting substance of what was actually happening. And, people like to kind of make their jokes about like, oh, God sacrificed himself to atone for the sins that were committed against him. And you're like, well, that's just incoherent. Why would God sacrifice himself to himself? And you can say all that if you like, but you're missing the much deeper and more profound and interesting significance of what's happening there. And I just think, why would you do that? Why would you just choose to miss all of the really interesting stuff going on? And the reality is that it's far more interesting to understand that this is a story about God saying, we don't need to sacrifice our children to God. That's what he says to Abraham. You don't need to do it. Before God then brings his point home by sacrificing himself as the ultimate sacrifice, and showing how meager, by comparison, the sacrifice of anybody else could be. Jesus was a sufficient sacrifice to atone for the sins of the entire world. And within that context, it just shows it's almost like, hey, remember when God said that you shouldn't just sacrifice your random kid? Well, doesn't it kind of drive that point home when you actually see what sacrifice it really takes to, kind of get anywhere in terms of overcoming the needs for atonement in light of human sin? And it's like, oh, it takes the sacrifice of literally God himself. It kind of if anything, to think, oh, well, this means that human sacrifice is a good thing. It's like, well, no, because there's no other human like Jesus. Basically, Jesus, if you like, was the sacrifice to end all sacrifices. So to say that this is not following on from the story of Abraham, I just don't think makes much sense. And I want to end with a final point. In the story of Abraham's taking Isaac up to do the sacrifice, and Isaac, being a very observant person, says, well, hold on a minute, we don't have a sheep to sacrifice, because traditionally you would sacrifice a sheep. It says, we don't have one. And Abraham says, it's okay. When we get to the top of the hill, God will provide the sheep for the sacrifice. And they get up there. Obviously, it's revealed that actually Abraham's going to sacrifice Isaac. Goes to do it, gets told not to. And then he looks around and he sees a sheep on the hill, and he sacrifices the sheep, and he's like, good, I did my sacrifice. So here's the crazy thing about that. That's Jesus, right? Like going up the hill, God provides the sacrifice, the sheep, the lamb. And that was like, well, I don't know, depends who's dating or believing. It was up to 1,500 years before Jesus came along, but you have that story. Who will provide the sheep for the sacrifice? Who will provide the object of the sacrifice? God will. And that's fulfilled by Jesus doing that. And that's just another example of like this insane, fantastic just coherence of this text that the author of Genesis didn't have to write that. Didn't have to write this detail about how we, basically saying we don't need to sacrifice our kids. God will provide the sacrifice. And then it builds. And then you get to Jesus, and he is God, and he provides the sacrifice. It's a really, really, really good book. I'm not saying like it's a super riveting read. There's lots of nonsense about like the particular construction of tents and buildings and temples and the number of people in each tribe and exactly where they're located and the precise borders of their lands and all that kind of stuff. And that's not riveting. But the actual, like, the structure of the book and the way it builds from one thing to the other, the way that things are set up, which just seem on the surface, like, you think about like a great twist in a film and like the way it's kind of like a great twist. It's not obvious until it happens, and then when it happens, it recontextualizes everything that came before it. That's Jesus. Like, it recontextualizes so much of what came before it. And that's why it's called the greatest story ever told, But yeah, and I would argue that actually, we talk about these great twists. These great twists are written over the course of one lifetime, usually. You think about like the great twists in films and books, usually written over the course of one lifetime by one person. The difference with the Bible is it was written over the course of hundreds of years by probably hundreds of different authors. And they all work together to build up this thing, which I would argue it's hard to explain without invoking the divine.